Hello, and welcome to the Myersbriggs podcast, a show where every other Wednesday I'll talk about the Myers-Briggs personality types in a new way that is easy to understand so you can improve your relationships with the people around you and also yourself by learning why exactly we are the way we are. I'm your host, Isaac, and today we're going to talk about how each of the 16 types takes in information using the Jungian perceiving cognitive functions. In the last episode, we talked about the judging cognitive functions, which we now know as introverted feeling, extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, and extroverted thinking. We also know that you can abbreviate them to FI, FE, TI, and TE, respectively, for time's sake. These functions also tell us that there are two kinds of thinking and feeling, both extroverted and introverted. To briefly summarize from the last episode, we know that Jung described the extroverted functions as objective because they rely on external information that most, if not all, people can verify as true when making decisions. By contrast, the introverted functions are subjective because the decision-making process is filtered through the person's own personal experiences before being communicated. We'll see these concepts play out today with the perceiving functions too. Both introverted and extroverted functions have their pros and cons and their place in life, neither one being better than the other, just different. We also talked about how each type is made up of 4 of the total 8 conscious cognitive functions, one of each attitude, meaning you have 1 of 2 thinking functions, 1 of 2 feeling functions, 1 of 2 sensing, and 1 of 2 intuition. The sensing and intuition attitudes are the perceiving functions that we'll be discussing in more depth today. In short, you can make decisions using thinking or feeling methods, and you can perceive information using sensing or intuition methods. But your preferences, and by extension your aptitude, for thinking versus feeling and sensing versus intuition are what dictates your MBTI type. Of your 4 conscious functions, your first 2 cognitive functions, your dominant and auxiliary functions, respectively, will be your strongest functions that contain your most preferred judging function out of the 4 available, and your most preferred perceiving function out of the 4 that are available for that category. If you're confident that you know your preferred judging function, regardless of whether it is your dominant or auxiliary, which we haven't talked about the nuances of those placements yet for simplicity's sake, but we will. For example, let's say your preferred judging function is TE, then your preferred perceiving function that pairs with it must be introverted. Either the sensing or intuition attitudes are possible, but according to the function stacks developed by Myers and Briggs, as extrapolated on Jung's work, your functions will alternate between extroverted and introverted. So if you know your preferred judging function already, you've just narrowed down your choice of perceiving functions from 4 down to 2. If you haven't listened to the previous episode about judging functions and you're super lost, you can stick around for this episode for the perceiving functions, but you should get a more proper introduction to the cognitive functions in the last episode, so I'd recommend you go check that out, and I'll meet you back here in like an hour. Okay, enough preamble, let's talk about the perceiving cognitive functions so we can learn about all the different ways that people like to absorb information and contextualize them in their brains so they can then use that information to make decisions with the judging functions that we talked about last time. The first of the 4 functions we'll talk about is extroverted sensing, or SE for short. And the types that will use high SE in either their dominant or auxiliary functions are ISTP, ESTP, ISFP, and ESFP, aka the XSXPs. The 16personalities.com website refers to this particular group of types as the artisans. In my opinion, this function is probably the most easily understood and even in some ways the least complex method of perception. It can be very common for some people to mistake the lack of complexity of this function for a lack of intelligence, skill, importance, all sorts of other positive traits, etc., etc. And I want to get ahead of that right now by saying that that could not be more wrong. There is often a lot of beauty and genius in simplicity. Some great examples of this come from famous pop culture quotes like Gladys from Portal 2, quote, "The best solution to a problem is usually the easiest one," or Michael Scott to Dwight Schrute from The Office, quote, "Keep it simple, stupid." It's brilliant, and it hurts his feelings every time. Alright, that's all well and good, but what actually is SE? SE, being an extroverted and therefore objective function, tells us that the type of information it absorbs is the kind that comes from the outside world and does not undergo any kind of personal filtering before the information is passed to the judging function. This information is observable by everybody. It being a sensing function tells us that this information is practical, concrete, and does not deal with abstract ideas or meanings assigned to it that you would expect to see with the intuition functions. So, SE is what everyone can objectively observe with no additional abstractions. If you're thinking that this sounds kind of like using your eyes and ears to experience the world around you, then you'd be right. Your 5 senses are the absolute fundamentals of using SE. These types observe their natural surroundings completely unfiltered and will use this information to make decisions based on what is happening right here, right now, drawing little to no assumptions about the information and choosing to act on what is currently in their control in the present moment. These are very practical types who can be quick to react in high-pressure situations because their focus on the present keeps them grounded and prevents them from overthinking and getting caught in an analysis paralysis. They're very much what you see is what you get kind of people, and are great at seizing the moment or opportunity before it passes them. This can be used for good or for evil. If it's good, they can really come through in a pinch or pull a situation together quickly. If it's one of their vices, then they probably demonstrate poor impulse control and lack of forethought. SE being the most straightforward of the perceiving functions means that these types often require the least amount of time to process information and can jump right into decision making. It's neither inherently good or bad, just fast, and to other types can seem sudden or disorienting. The other sensing function is introverted sensing, abbreviated as SI. The types that use this function as their dominant or auxiliary function are ISTJ, ESTJ, ISFJ, and ESFJ. They're all XSXJ types. 16personalities.com calls this group of types the Sentinels. We're still focused on practical and concrete information because this is a sensing function, but now we're focusing it inward because it's an introverted function. Instead of focusing on the here and now like the high SE users, these types tend to focus on what has happened in the past in order to inform their decisions in the present. They focus on the past because those experiences are still practical, but there has also been sufficient time for the high SI user to absorb and contextualize the information and lessons they learned from previous experience that they can apply to future situations. The subjective nature of the introverted orientation of this function comes in here because the key takeaways a high SI user obtains from an experience is going to be colored by their subjective point of view. It's like how multiple people can experience the same thing at the same time and place, but they don't always remember it the same way. Different people can learn different lessons from the same situation, and the lesson they learn is dependent on what they think will be most useful to them in the future. This makes it sound like, by contrast, high SE users should all observe the same things and collect the same information all the time, which isn't really true or possible, but in a hypothetical vacuum, this would be a much more likely occurrence. In short, past experience is big for high SI users. This goes for their own experience, obviously, but it also goes for other people's experience too. Because what should they do if they are experiencing something for the first time? There is a first time for everything, after all. When this happens, they're likely to value the previous experience or anecdotes of somebody else who is more experienced. Or if they're an ISTJ or ISFJ and feel like keeping to themselves as an introvert, they will search for written documentation from a trusted source in their organization. This can sound like the judging function TE, because TE likes facts, figures, and verifiable sources, but that's for decision making, and just about any reputable, verifiable source will do. High SI users are looking to collect information, and while they can take it from anywhere reputable, they would rather take it from a source they know to be close to the situation so they can personally verify it as reputable, instead of having someone else's stamp of approval like the high TE users typically accept. If it's trouble in school, they'll want help from a classmate or a friend who previously took the class with the same teacher. If it's at work, they'll want a written procedure that was developed by someone on their team or a previous employee who used to be on the project. If none of these things exist, which will be sure to stress the high SI user out, they will see to it that some kind of official documentation or written protocol, instructions, cheat sheet, anything to refer back to is created promptly to make future situations easier. Not having anything to reference back to when making a decision is usually uncomfortable for high SI users, but having a reference written and developed by them in their own words can be the most ideal scenario for them. So the worst case scenario kind of provokes them into rectifying the best case scenario for themselves. If it hasn't been made clear yet, organization tends to be very important to these types. That about sums up the two sensing functions, so now we're going to move to the intuition functions, starting with extroverted intuition, or NE. The intuition functions are all about ideas, concepts, and more abstract things that aren't quite as tangible or easily observable as the types of things the sensing functions deal with. The types that have NE in the dominant or auxiliary function are INTP, ENTP, INFP, and ENFP. So all the XNXP types. This group and the next group doesn't have a name assigned to it by 16personalities.com, sadly, so that's the end of that. You know the drill by now. NE is an extroverted function, so it's got to be objective in some way. So how can you talk about abstract concepts objectively? That sounds kind of weird at first, but in context, I think it makes a lot of sense, which, side note, as an INTP whose dominant function is TI, saying, quote, I think it makes a lot of sense, is such a stereotypical thing to say, and it just makes me laugh. NE's biggest signification is that it deals with a variety of new ideas that don't exist yet, but they could if we wanted them to. High NE users feel most comfortable when they can look at the current situation and zero in on what could happen next. Where the objectivity comes into play is that high NE users don't discriminate between possibilities. In fact, the more future possibilities you can consider for an idea, the better, because if it's technically possible in any way, shape, or form, they think everyone should be aware of it. Now, that doesn't mean that they aren't discerning about what is more likely or less likely. They do consider that too. The point is that if there is a chance of something happening next with respect to the current situation, it should be taken into account. Another way to think about how objectivity manifests is that, generally speaking, if a high NE user labels something as a possibility, it is usually recognizable by everybody that something does in fact have the potential of occurring. Not everyone is likely to agree exactly how likely or how important it is to consider all of these possibilities, but the objective fact is that to some degree, everyone does have to acknowledge the potential for alternative scenarios and things of that nature. A high NE user could say it might rain today because there's some cloud cover. Other types might try to disagree and say it probably won't rain because the clouds are white, not black, and the wind is blowing at 13 miles per hour south by southwest, blah, blah, blah. But the high NE user's response will always be, yeah, that's all true, but the wind could start blowing the other direction. The clouds might change color later, etc., etc. The point is that at the end of the day, the high NE user is basically saying, can you tell me with absolute certainty beyond the shadow of a doubt that it will not rain today, even if you don't personally think it will? The answer is no. It's still a possibility that, depending on the day, increases or decreases in likelihood, and therefore should be moved up and down the list of potential priorities to consider, but it cannot and should not be removed from that list unless you're absolutely certain it won't rain. Because of their affinity for thinking of alternative ideas, high NE users tend to be great in brainstorming sessions, especially if people need new solutions to persistent problems. They can be a little unorthodox, which can cause some people to be skeptical about the ideas they bring to the table, especially if they haven't been verified to be safe or effective, etc., etc. Because they can be so intuitive or creative with the way they choose to absorb information, they can sometimes have a hard time with long-standing existing ways of doing things. The explanation, this is the way it's always been done, does very little to convince a high NE user to start doing it the way everyone else is. Being the opposite of SI in a lot of ways, these two functions can often clash with each other if they aren't careful. High NE users can also have the tendency to overlook the present and practical solutions that are right in front of their face because they're considering overly complicated possibilities instead of the matter at hand. And the final of all 8 cognitive functions to talk about is introverted intuition, known as NI for short. The types that use this function as either their dominant or auxiliary function are INTJ, ENTJ, INFJ, and ENFJ, so all of the XNXJ types. This is probably the most abstract and difficult to understand, or at least most difficult to put into words function, which is why I saved it for last. I think a healthy understanding of SE can also help form your understanding of NI, since they are essentially opposite perceiving functions. It's intuition, so we know that we're dealing with abstract ideas and concepts like NE, but the introverted orientation gives it a subjective and personal flair to it that adds to the ineffable and hard to describe quality of NI. But this is the Myers-Briggs University podcast, so we're going to have to find a way to describe it. If NE feels more comfortable seeing a variety of objective possibilities, then NI takes the other side of things, where they want to take all of the information they can and condense it down into very concise and meaningful ideas that can be applied universally to any or at least most situations, at the expense of making them sound like they are all simply natural-born philosophers. The high NI users are looking for the truth with a capital T of any situation. They want the higher meanings, the life lessons, the distilled fundamental summations of situations or concepts' place in life. If you're familiar with literally any cliche saying like, life is what happens while you're busy making other plans, or you have to look through the rain to see the rainbow, then you've probably seen the work of a high NI user in some way. They've spent a long time compiling a lot of information from a lot of different places in order to extract the most important and essential universal ideas that can be useful and applicable to almost everyone. When we talked about SE, I mentioned that they are very much in the here and now kind of people who they call it like they see it, for better or for worse. They act on impulse a lot of times, and they can be great in sudden emergency situations because they can quickly and objectively assess the circumstances and respond appropriately without wasting much time. We're characterizing NI to be pretty much the opposite of SE, so suffice to say that high NI users aren't going to be naturally gifted with any of those traits, so what do they have? Well, if SE is good at responding on a very granular, instance-specific kind of level, then NI is going to be naturally inclined to assess what many emergency situations all have in common on a much more zoomed-out, big-picture level. What are the fundamental similarities that all of the emergencies have that required a high SE user's presence to resolve them? What does the frequency of these emergency situations say about our emergency preparedness? What does it say about our institution's values as a whole that we allow these emergencies to happen at such a rate? If the high NI user can answer all of these questions, they can use these answers to inform some very powerful, goal-oriented decisions to change the circumstances on a larger, broader scale. This makes it sound like a pretty powerful cognitive function that can do some amazing things if given the time to properly incubate. Of course, there are also pretty obvious drawbacks with this function, the first being that it can be very hard to communicate these ideas to other people. And even if you can communicate them, doesn't mean that other people won't see things the same way that the high NI user does, because NI is an introverted function and has a layer of subjectivity to it that other people might not agree with. The other drawback is that, similar to NE, it isn't always the most practical function. The situation doesn't always call for fundamental changes to a system to improve it forever. If something isn't working correctly at work, it might not be the system that is broken, but just a single employee who needs some guidance, or even a third-party collaborator who's dragging their feet when your team is actually totally killing it. This isn't to say that high NI users can't operate on a practical and granular level. Everybody can, and everybody has to sometimes. But when they do operate on that type of level, it might not always come as naturally, and to compensate for that, they try to frame how their practical actions contribute to a much higher body of work in the process. Needless to say, the 8 Jungian cognitive functions have a lot of depth to them that I can only hope to scratch the surface of in 2 measly podcast episodes. The nuances of all of the cognitive functions that I haven't already covered will make their way out of the woodwork in the future episodes, as the topics we cover will also get more granular and specific. In the meantime, I think we have a pretty good foundation of what all the functions are like and what some of their strengths and weaknesses are. I will probably expand on this more in a future episode, but I mentioned that if you know your preferred judging function, no matter if it's your dominant or auxiliary function, then you can narrow down your preferred perceiving function by reversing the extroverted-introverted orientation. As an INTP, my dominant function is TI, or you can just say that I'm a TI Dom for short. If my preferred judging function is introverted, then my preferred perceiving function should be extroverted. And because I already know my type and I know that I'm an intuitive, then my auxiliary function has to be NE. Like I said, we'll talk more about that in the future, so if you're still confused, that's okay. For now, just think about the 8 functions, try to understand them, think about which ones resonate with you, or even, if you can, observe them in other people that you know well too. I think maybe for the next episode, or at least part of it, we'll talk about the order of your 4 conscious cognitive functions. So far, I've talked about your dominant and auxiliary functions like they're the same because they are both high in your function stack, but there are differences between them, otherwise we wouldn't have different names for them. So we'll talk about that, and we'll cover the other functions too. We'll see. I have to know how much information there is before choosing to throw all of it into one episode or split it up into multiple ones. That is what happened to the intro to cognitive functions episodes, after all. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for tuning into the Myers-Briggs University podcast today. If you want more personality content before the next episode, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/mbuniversity. For only $5 a month, you can participate in a private group chat about all things personality with myself and other members. You'll gain access to written transcripts of all my episodes, and I'll even give you a fun, personalized shout out here on the podcast. If you're not interested in monetary support, that's totally fine. You can always just leave a review of the podcast, hopefully 5 stars. to help all of the algorithms get the podcast to new people who could benefit from tuning into the episode you just listened to. You can also interact with me on socials, mainly Instagram and Tumblr, where I'll just post funny memes and a wealth of additional MBTI information too. Links to those in the description. If you have content, suggestions, or MBTI-related questions that you'd like for me to address on the podcast, then feel free to reach out. You can text or call my Google voicemail. Don't worry, it goes straight to voicemail. I won't pick up. At 216-264-3997, or you can email me at myersbriggsuniversity@gmail.com. I'll either play your voicemail audio or I'll read your email aloud, but either way, I will answer your questions right here on the podcast if you want. And make sure you leave your name and your personality type if you want those to be included in your question. Thanks so much again for tuning in to the Myers-Briggs University podcast, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. I've been your host, Isaac, and have a great day. Until next time.